hold our hands up. We're about the same skin color. We're talking about the same America that we both live in. And how is it possible for two people to see the same thing so differently? We saw this in other cases. Look at the Kavanaugh hearings. Same set of facts available to everybody, and yet two groups of people see the same facts totally differently. Now, part of the reason for this, I believe, in my debate with Jackson was that I was bringing the immigrant perspective and he was bringing the perspective of someone born and raised in this country. So someone born and raised in this country is going to judge America by what can be called the utopian standard. America measured against its own ideals. America measured against perfection. America measured against the Garden of Eden. The immigrant never does that. The immigrant's always going to compare America to some other existing country. So one may say that the immigrant is using a comparative or historical standard, not a utopian standard. And that brings a different kind of analysis compared to what? Now, I want to talk about what's happening in American politics today. Ever since Trump's election, I think you know, we actually haven't had anything resembling a legitimate policy debate, a debate about principles or ideas. The air has actually been thick with two accusations: racism and fascism. And these two accusations, made often against Trump, often against the right, against conservatives. But behind them is a whole kind of progressive historiography. Because it would make no sense, for example, to say Trump is a fascist if behind it there wasn't a deeper assumption: fascism is on the right. If fascism were not on the right, it would make no sense to say Trump is a fascist. And yet the notion that fascism is on the right long predates Trump. The notion that fascism is on the right goes back to World War II. It's an old idea. So what I'd like to do is I want to zoom in and say a word about racism, and then I want to say a word about fascism. And in both cases, I'm actually trying to challenge what I'm going to call fake history. Fake history. We're used to hearing about fake news, but I'm talking not just about a news story, but the story behind the story, the meta-narrative, the big story. And I want to begin, I'll say a few words about race, and I'm going to turn to fascism. I want to look not just at history, but where is the racism and fascism, if there is any, now? Where is it in American politics today? That's really where I want to go. So let's start with racism. Racism, of course, in America developed out of the slave plantation. It became an ideology sustained by the practice of widespread domestic slavery. Very often this racism is pinned on the American founders. But of course, slavery in America began 150 years before the founders. The first slaves came to America around 1619. Slavery had been in America 150 years before Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. And therefore, when Jefferson says things that seem to us now odd, he goes that the abolition of slavery is the great object of desire of these colonies. All the colonies, the North and the South. This is Jefferson. And to understand what he's talking about, he's blaming the British for introducing and institutionalizing slavery in America against the will of the American people, North and South. The plantation system that we today identify with slavery did not exist in a mass form in the founding. In fact, it took Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793 after the founding for the whole ideology of cotton is king to take hold, and the vast network of plantations that dotted the American South developed very strongly between 1793 and the 1830s. That developed in the 1820s a new political party, the Democratic Party, which became the defender and the protector of the slave plantation. And in fact, the apologies for slavery that we see in the 19th century, there's no echo of that in the American founding at all. Jefferson, who owned slaves, will say things like, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. The Almighty has no attribute that will take our side in this contest." This kind of moral condemnation of slavery that you find in the founding disappears from America in the 19th century, and the Democratic Party becomes the explicit defender of slavery. Abraham Lincoln, by the way, knew this. And Abraham Lincoln knew that the problem was not with the South. The problem was with the Democratic Party in the North and the South, which worked together to protect slavery. When Lincoln named what he called the four bad guys of slavery, he named them. Three of them were Northern Democrats. Only one, Roger Taney, who wrote the Dred Scott decision, was a Southerner. I mean, he was from Maryland. But the other three, Franklin Pierce, the former president from New Hampshire, James Buchanan, the sitting president from Pennsylvania, and Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's famous rival from Illinois, notice that they're all Northern Democrats. This is very important today because when Antifa types like the kid we saw here knocking down Confederate statues, that game is aimed at pinning the blame of slavery entirely on the South. There's a big statue of Franklin Pierce. There's a huge statue and monument to Stephen Douglas in Chicago, completely untouched. Why? Because progressive historiography has to hide the complicity of the Northern Democrats in protecting slavery. You got to pretend like it was all Robert E. Lee, even though Robert E. Lee opposed slavery and opposed secession and only went to fight because he thought he had to defend his home state and his own family. Now, this is slavery. But of course, the thrust of the progressive argument today is that we don't have to worry about all that because in those days, Abraham Lincoln was actually a liberal. Abraham Lincoln was actually a progressive. He would have been a Democrat today. And in fact, the two parties have kind of switched sides. And this is actually worth considering for a moment. First of all, Abraham Lincoln never called himself a liberal. Nor did he ever call himself a progressive, a term that actually came into currency only in the late 19th and early 20th century. The term that Abraham Lincoln used to describe himself repeatedly was, yes, conservative. Because Lincoln said, "I'm conserving the principles of the American founding." Lincoln saw himself as defending the anti-slavery principles of the founding. And when Lincoln defined slavery, he defined it this way: you work, I eat. So for Lincoln, the key to slavery isn't even the racial aspect that's there, but the key to it is theft. One guy works, and the other guy takes the fruit of his labor. And Lincoln says that this is the operating principle, not of the South, but of the Democratic Party. And against it, Lincoln posits the principle of what he calls the Republican Party, which he describes this way: the hand that makes the corn has the right to put the corn into its own mouth. In other words, people have a right to keep the fruits of their labor. And this is Lincoln's view of social justice. Social justice is, I keep what I earn, and you keep what you earn. And the brain surgeon has no more right to take the wages of the street sweeper than the street sweeper has the right to take the wages of the brain surgeon. Both those things would amount to theft. And very interestingly, when we say this, and I mentioned this is now from more than 150 years ago, we see the resonance of these principles even today. What does the Republican Party stand for now, if not the fact that people have the right to keep their stuff? And what does the Democratic Party stand for now? The party has changed, a lot of things are different, but its core principle is still the same. You work, I eat. You work, they can confiscate the fruits of your labor, and they get to decide what to do with that. I mentioned this to show that the parties have changed, but certain things also remain the same. There's continuity in history, no less than discontinuity. Did the parties swap sides? We hear that the racist Dixiecrats, who were seduced by Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, became Republicans. Both in my book and my movie, I put up a list of all the racist Dixiecrats on the screen. There's well over 100 of them, both in the House and the Senate. And then I start to count. How many of those racist Dixiecrats became Republicans? And the correct answer is precisely 2. 2. One in the House, Albert Watson, and one in the Senate, Strom Thurmond. And all the other racist Dixiecrats lived and stayed and died in the Democratic Party. And many of them lionized as Democrats. Debbie and I were in Washington, D.C. recently. There are buildings in Washington named after them. So the notion that the racist Dixiecrats became Republicans is an empirical falsehood. And in fact, the whole notion that Nixon did this is completely preposterous for the simple reason that when Nixon became president, the first thing he did was he implemented America's first affirmative action program. It was called the Philadelphia Plan, implemented in 1969, the first legal program in United States history to give legal preferences to non-whites or blacks over whites. So think about it. If you have a racist candidate trying to court a racist base, does it make any sense to implement a preferential program that favors blacks over whites? This makes absolutely no sense. So the whole notion of Nixon's Southern strategy is bogus, fake history. Now, when I say these things, I have to pause because I say to myself, I realize I'm actually running against a point of view that has been drummed into you and into a lot of Americans for a long time by a lot of people. And I have to raise the question of how is it that you, smart guys at a smart university, how do you get to know things that are actually false? The answer is that your education is built on what can be called progressive historiography. And what I mean by that is that the progressives who came to power in the 50s and 60s, almost a generation ago, they wrote the history books. And they wrote books that said fascism is on the right, and their colleagues who were like-minded cheered them, and the New York Review of Books published favorable reviews, and NPR did interviews with the authors, and then Michael Moore came rolling in to make a documentary, or Steven Spielberg gave the point of view a cameo in a movie, and then the guys at Wikipedia got a hold of it. So here you are, smart guy, and you say, wow, fascism has to be on the right because there it is in Barnes & Noble, and there it is on the History Channel, and there it is on Wikipedia, and I heard something on NPR. So the fact, even though it's the same bullet that is ricocheting from one wall to another, you get it from all different directions, and you think, wow, it's got to be true, even though you weren't there. Now, very interestingly, the progressives who said these things and wrote these books, they were there. They actually knew better. But they also knew that when American troops went into the gas chambers and American troops liberated those starving, emaciated, ghostly figures and pulled them out, and the whole world saw these images of fascism and Nazism, they knew that fascism and Nazism are permanently discredited. And they figured that if young people in the future, like you, ever figured out that fascism and Nazism were not only on the left, but were in bed with the left, then the whole game would be over. The Democratic Party would be finished. You might say, what do you mean finished? Well, the Whig Party used to be a party in America, and it went away. It collapsed, it disappeared. It was unviable. The Democratic Party, in 2 or 3 key moments of its history, has faced existential danger. And one of them was right after World War II. Now, this requires a little bit of explanation. I'm going to pivot for a moment into fascism. Because in order to understand fascism, notice it's a word that we use all the time. Like you just have to turn on like MSNBC. There's Rachel Maddow, Chris Matthews. Fascism. But you don't get the sense that if you said, define it, they could. Or their definitions would be so all over the place that you'd have trouble grasping what fascism even is. Now, we have to be careful here because when we think of fascism now, we automatically think of the gas chambers and the Holocaust. And that's fascism circa 1945. But that's not how Mussolini became a powerful figure in Italy in the 20s. And that's not how the Nazi Party was the largest political party in Germany in the 30s. Fascism was a political movement that campaigned. It had an ideology. It had a philosophy. I want to say a word about that. Fascism grew out of the crisis of Marxism. And what I mean by this is that the Marxists had predicted in the 19th century that because of this clash between the bourgeois and the working class, there would be revolutions exploding all over Europe. And these revolutions never happened. And so when the 20th century came along, the Marxists were embarrassed. They were like, the prophecies of Marx are not proving to be true. Why is that? What did Marx get wrong? Ultimately, Mussolini decided that what Marx got wrong is that for Marx, the sole dividing line was class. Whereas, as Mussolini saw it, people are not so much attached to their class as they are attached to their country. Mussolini saw that in World War I, the German socialists fought for Germany, and the French socialists fought for France. And so Mussolini said, there's only one kind of socialism that will work in the future. It is National Socialism. It is socialism that marries people's deep attachment to their country with socialist, left-wing, redistributionist, welfare state ideals. And that is where Hitler got the idea that his party should be called the National Socialist Party. Because it was an attempt to rescue Marxism from its historical failure by engrafting onto it the new idea of nationalism. Now, all the leading fascist parties in Europe, there were fascist parties in Britain, in France, in Belgium, in Italy, in Germany. Every single founder of modern fascism was a man of the left. There is no exception to this rule. And the core idea of fascism was really simple. Government control of the private economy and government control of the lives of the citizens. That's the idea of it. That's what it's about. Mussolini put it beautifully, everything in the state and nothing outside the state. The state ultimately runs the economy, the state runs your life. Now, this does not sound like Trump. This, in fact, is chillingly similar to the ideology of the left. The ideology that says, number one, the government regulates the private economy. This isn't a government takeover of the private economy. The government's just telling the private industry what to do. Obamacare. You have private hospitals, you have private healthcare, private insurance, but who sets prices? Who says what can be covered? Who tells these people what to do? Government control of the economy. And the second thing, government control of your lives, which is to say, not simply how you act, but more critically, how you think. So when Debbie and I were in Nuremberg and Munich shooting this movie, and very interesting to watch footage of early Nazism, because you see German families flying the swastika flag off their balcony, and you see them doing the Heil Hitler salute, and I thought to myself, very interesting, why are they doing that? I mean, Heil Hitler, Hitler's not there. Why are you Heil Hitlering? What are you trying to say? And then I realized what they're trying to say. What they're trying to say is not, I'm an enthusiastic Nazi, but I am a cowardly worm that doesn't want to go against the state. I am an obedient scoundrel that you can tell me what to do, whether it is to salute or march or go to war or kill Jews. I'm ready to do it because I'm not willing to oppose the prevailing ideology. And this is what the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, which is basically mobilizing the whole society in lockstep with its ideology. And intimidating, bullying, and threatening people, sounds a little familiar, who march out of lockstep. Because ultimately, the aggression of the fascist left is always that they're never content until they have the whole thing. Think about the left in this country today. They have the media. They have academia for the most part. They have Hollywood. They have Broadway. They have the music industry. They have almost all the comedians. You think that would be enough? No. They want the NFL. A bunch of guys running with a ball. They want the NFL. They want the Boy Scouts. They pretty much got the Boy Scouts. They want the Christian baker. You got to bake a cake. Even if he goes to the Supreme Court and wins, that's okay. Sue him again. Destroy his life. Why? It's not about him. It's showing all the other worms out there that you better not threaten the ideology that we have, or we'll go get you too. In other words, at the end of the day, there's a certain habit of mind that is not content until all of us fly the swastika flag off our balcony. And that's a way of saying we give in. We succumb to the prevailing ideology of the state. Now that is actually fascism. It's also fascism to use the weapons of the state against your opponents. A situation with which I have a little bit of depressing familiarity. Well, to be honest, it is possible to encounter the state even if you've done something wrong and see it in its full power. In my case, I exceeded the campaign finance law. I was over-enthusiastic in trying to help a friend of mine. I just kept giving her money, and I exceeded the campaign finance law by $20,000. But the candidate didn't know, to no benefit to me. I got nothing out of it. She was sure to lose. She happened to be a classmate of mine. So the government comes to me, this is the Holder Justice Department, and they basically say, did you exceed the campaign finance law? I say, yes, I did, and I should receive the same penalty as anybody else who did the same thing. And that's when the game gets interesting, because they say, not so fast. They say, we're going to get you for bank fraud. And I say, bank fraud? And they say, well, yeah, because you took your money out of your bank account. I go, whoa. They go, we're going to get you for mail fraud. I say, mail fraud? They go, yeah, because you put your check in the mail. I'm like, wow. And then I realize what's going on. They're taking the same thing I did. They're re-describing it 7 different ways. They are drawing on the federal accordion-like statutes, many of which were put into place to get the mafia or get ISIS, ways of getting Al Capone on a technicality if you couldn't get him for murder. And they're using those against their political opponents to try to get them. And it was very clear to me that if those guys, by which I mean the Obama administration, could have locked me up for 10 years for doing what I did, they would have been delighted to do it. That was their goal. Their goal was, Dinesh is not a critic, he's an enemy. We got to get rid of him. He's even more dangerous because he's not a white guy. And he didn't take a DNA test that showed him to be 1/1024th. He's a real Indian. By the way, Debbie and I were at the Texas rally for Trump. I'd never been to a political rally, so I kind of wanted to see Trump, doing his thing. And Trump is very different than the man I kind of cut my teeth on in politics, which is Reagan. Trump has a way of going after his critics. The media. Reagan was above the fray, Trump is in the fray. In the rally, he referred to Maxine Waters as a very low IQ individual. But the debate is not settled. I understand that Maxine Waters is taking an IQ test. She's in the 9th percentile, but that's remarkable. That means that only 91% of Americans are smarter than her. That's it. I think she thinks it's a complete refutation of Trump's allegation that she's the dumbest politician in America. In any event, fascism. If we're looking for fascist tactics today, we find them not on the right, but on the left. Trump is being savaged on every platform every second of every day. People say, Trump's an authoritarian. Well, any real authoritarian would have shut that down. Mussolini would have sent some brown shirts to beat up the guys at CNN. How hard would that be, Jim Acosta? But Trump doesn't do that. Trump is basically a mud wrestler. And for the first time, what he's done is he's taken the left and said, all right, you want to mud wrestle? Come into the mud with the greatest mud wrestler in American history. want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to draw quickly to a close. Ultimately, it seems to me the most important thing in a university is truth. Not diversity, not even liberty. It's truth itself. The reason liberty is important is it is the necessary mechanism to get to the truth. You need free and open debate to pursue the elusive quarry of truth. The beauty of living today is that we can check our facts. When I say things like, no Republican in 1860 owned a slave, all the slaves in the country were owned by Democrats, you can check. And you only need a single counterexample to make me take it back. Or if I say the racist Dixiecrats never converted, all you have to do is pull out your phone and call them up and look for yourself, and you'll see who's right. So the beauty of today is we are in a position to challenge assumptions, even though they have been somehow drummed into us from a young age. And so I want to invite you to think with an open mind. Let's have the kind of civil debate that someone tried to shut down today. There needs to be more of this in schools like Michigan State. And the only way it will happen is if you demand it. If you say, it's part of my education to have it. And because otherwise, I think part of the problem with the like-mindedness of people on the faculty and the administration is they're quite content with letting progressive historiography rule the day. And I'm not saying that the progressives are lying outright. I'm just saying that they have the human tendency to suppress facts that make their side look bad. And they have a human tendency to try to take the things that they did and pin them on the other side. And that has been happening, I think, to unfortunate effect in American politics today. Lincoln once said, "The fiery trial through which we pass will light us in honor or in dishonor down to the latest